All right. Hello again, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Very excited to go through some very important information and some very key insights, both from a theoretical and a technology perspective, as far as converging content and commerce in a very complex world. My name is Matt. I work on the marketing team here at Mozu, and I am excited to be joined by Paula Rosenblum, who is the managing partner at RSR, and Jason Wallis, who's our Chief Technology Officer here at Mozu. Paula's going to run through a few topics, especially focusing on consistency, which is retail's new imperative, and some key information there. And then Jason, fondly known as Wallis around these parts, and he will go through how you can achieve that from a technology perspective. So without further ado, let's introduce the experts and bring them into play. So Paula, feel free to take it away.
Thanks a lot, Matt. How's everybody this morning? I hope you're all well. Today we're going to if there's two messages I leave you with today, they are, one, consistency, the importance of consistency in retail's new competitive imperative, and the second is constant change. That I don't see any time where change is going to stop. So let's take a look at what I'm going to talk with you about today on the next slide. I'm going to give you a brief overview of my company, RSR, and a little bit about me. Talk to you about retail's reset moment and how continuous transformation really is the new norm, and it's not going away anytime. This model that we talk about called the 5 C's of omnichannel retailing, and maybe that there is a 6th C, and as a tip, that 6th C is consistency. Some relevant research findings that we use to justify this approach, and then finally key takeaways for retailers. So with that, a little bit about my company. RSR Research just turned 7 on June 15th. We had a goal. We had a very different goal. We didn't just want to look at technology in a vacuum. We wanted to look at technology within the context of the business issues and opportunities that retailers face. And we wanted to elevate that conversation to a strategic level. And we do that through a couple of ways. One is we provide very strategic, objective, and pragmatic advice, and we leverage what amounts to well more than 75 years of retail expertise. 2 of the 4 of us are former CIOs, and the other 2 of us have had a variety of positions in the retail industry. We do a lot of research. You're going to see some of that data here today, and we provide it free to anybody who wants to read it. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Enough about us. There's no doubt that in the last 7 years, retail has gone through what we call a reset moment, where almost every single thing has changed. And if we take a look, we'll see what that difference looks like. It's a world that really was built around, it's a worldview that was built around the cash register or the store, or potentially, another click please, or potentially built around straight direct web shopping, meeting a world on the next slide that we'll see, which is designed around, enabled by smartphones. That was the defining moment in 2007, ironically 3 months after we incorporated as a company, and social media. And the combination of social media and mobility has completely changed the retail world irrevocably. And give that another click, please. And what it's done is it's created a fundamental and dramatic shift in the power dynamic between retailers and consumers. I'm of the opinion that consumers still fundamentally have the same kinds of activities that they engaged in before the advent of social networks and smartphones. The difference is they can do it faster, and they can do it broader than ever before. The smartphone makes it faster, and the social networks make it broader. So this has changed everything irrevocably. And if we move to the next slide, I'll show you how it's changed things particularly. The world used to be pretty linear. Consumer behaviors were fairly predictable. And whatever paths they were going on, investigating, selecting, pay for, to fulfillment, tended to be very linear in the channel they were in. So in other words, they'd walk into a store, look at some products. They'd pick one out, they'd go to the front of the store, they'd pay for it, they'd take the product in their bag, take it to their car, and go home. Or they would be on the web where they would do some investigation, they'd click select somewhere, They would then pay for the product, and they would wait for delivery to come to their house. So this is a very, very orderly kind of way to manage, your world. But if we take a look at the next slide, we'll see that these consumer behaviors have changed pretty dramatically to where they're very chaotic. I mean, we've been hearing about showrooming for, 3 years now maybe, and now a new term is web rooming. Web rooming means they do their research online, then they go in stores. To me, this was sort of obvious. But mobile was the biggest disruptor that just made those paths to purchase completely chaotic. And retailers' response to that is what's driving a lot of our decision making and a lot of our IT purchases today. So let's move to the next slide, please. And where we've got to now is that this whole cross-channel chaotic kind of behavior is no longer a why question for retailers. Instead, it's become a how. And the hows are pretty specific. How can I improve the experience my customer has when she visits any of the touch points where she might find me? How do I maximize the money that I spend on inventory to satisfy the customer? How can I future-proof my enterprise in some way or another, or at least plan for the future as best I can? And I think for me, in some ways, most importantly, how do we organize ourselves? How do we redefine our processes to account for this sort of omni-channel, varied channel world? And in fact, the number of channels where consumers can find out about the things we sell are becoming almost infinite. And that's how the term omni-channel really came into existence. It was trying to encapsulate this notion of people can find out about us anywhere, anyhow. So the challenge ahead is very clear. It's navigating a pretty transformative internal change, not just on the customer-facing side, but also internally. How do we get leverage with our content, with our products? How do we get leverage with our brand across any place a customer can find us? Next slide, please. And once you get to that, the biggest question, which is always top of mind for every retailer, is how do I accomplish all of those things I just said? How do I get all of this done and make money too? Because if you can do it, if you take a look at the next slide, you'll see that there's a payoff. And the payoff is interesting. Now, first, the problem. In virtually every benchmark that we run, we can find several things coming out. One is that IT portfolios are a mess. I don't know any company that's walked up to me and said, I have a really clean IT portfolio. They're complicated, they're convoluted, they're hard to change, and yet they have to change. Every time a new channel comes along, we have to adapt to it. We have to go to it. The emergence of marketing has created a tremendous challenge for retailers because they can afford their own information technology often bought through their agency. Now, on the one hand, that allows them to respond quickly, but over the long term, it may not be to their best long-term advantage because it creates fragmentation. And going back to the first bullet point, it adds more complexity and convolution to already messy IT portfolios. There's a recognition that within all of this, we have to create a single face that we present to the customer. And we also know that cross-channel customers are more profitable. And I'll show you that in just a second. But even though they're more profitable, every single retailer I talk to recognizes that they're leaving money on the table in any one of those ways I described, whether through managing content or managing inventory or managing the channels in some form or another. And they are continually pressed, and I'll show you some data on this later, to recognize that consumers really do want consistency in their experience. They don't care about your problems, they care about their problems. Now, if you can solve for this, if you can get all of this, under control, the punchline is really there. And if we go to the next slide, you should see it. And that is, as you can see, year after year, retailers report that their cross-channel or multi-channel customers are at least somewhat more profitable than single-channel customers. And now close to half report that they're significantly more profitable than single-channel customers. And to me, the most interesting part of this chart isn't just how much more profitable cross-channel or multi-channel customers are. It's also that the percentage of those retailers who don't know or can't tell has dropped pretty significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. Between 2005 and I'll say 2010, that number hovered between 28 and 30%. And all of a sudden it's dropped dramatically to 18, which means that retailers have started to respond and recognize the value that lives in those cross-channel customers. But the question becomes, how do we maximize the money that we can make? How do we maximize our earnings? And then finally, not only are multi-channel customers more profitable, but there's a lot of data emerging that tell us that mobile shoppers spend even more than traditional web shoppers. So the cross-channel customer that also engages in mobile is even more profitable than traditional shoppers. So with that as a backdrop, let's move to the next slide, and let's take a look at what RSR calls the 5 Cs. This model was developed by my partner Nikki in 2009, and it actually has some legs. It's still pretty powerful, but we do have this 6th C that we need to consider now. And let's start taking a look at the 5 Cs if we can. At the center of the 5 Cs, the 5 Cs in a nutshell are customer, community, commerce, content, and context. And context surrounds the whole picture. The customer is at the center. And the customer is at the center because it's not what you want to sell that's important. It's what, when, where, how, and in what means a consumer wants to buy. And so the customer is completely at the center of this model. Let's take a step to the next slide and take a look at the next C. The next C is context. Now, context is really important because you want to make sure you're solving the problem that the customer wants to have solved at any given point in her path to purchase. And if we go to the next slide, you can see some interesting data around that or some thoughts around that. Depending on where the customer is in her decision process or where she is in physical proximity to you, you're going to have different kinds of content, different kinds of community, different kinds of commerce features that you're going to accent. The further away and the lowest awareness that a customer has, you want to make sure that you're educating rather than selling. You're looking at category rather than specific items. And commerce is there, but it's not necessarily featured. And you can see as you move through this process from awareness to selection and from far proximity to near proximity, you want to get more and more focused, more and more kind of relevant to the space where they are. So the key takeaway on this slide, which could take we could spend hours on it, the key takeaway is that relevancy, context is all about relevancy, and it's all tied to the behavior that the consumer is acting upon in that given moment. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see the next C, and that C is content. And that's everything that a retailer can bring to bear to help the consumer solve the problem. If we take a look at the next slide, please, we can get into the details of that. So early in the buying process, as I said, content is much more educational. It may be more relevant as a category rather than a product level. So what kinds of LED TVs are you interested in, for example? Or do you want LED or plasma? And some of the content that you can think about are category information, reviews, recommendations, blogs, videos, comments, comparisons and analysis, photos, zooming pictures, flipping 360 degrees. There's lots of different kinds of content. And again, what's important about the content is that it be in context to where the consumer is in her process. If we go to the next slide, please. Next is community. And community that's one of the big changes that happened in 2007 with the advent of social networks and social media. And that is that we like to find out what others who've solved this particular problem or made this particular purchase have thought about it. What do they have to say? And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that can encompass a whole bunch of different areas. The community can be the retailer or brand employees who hopefully can share what they know. And one of the challenges you guys know in retail today is making the employees as smart as the customer. Smart meaning educated on the particular product. That's not always so easy. Friends and family, obviously, people like me, trusted reviewers, and crowdsourced opinions. Now, again, there's always been a community, and there's always been a lot of back and forth between what do we think about this product? How did you enjoy this mattress? How did you feel about this stereo system? The difference is that everything has become much broader. And if we look at the next slide, we can talk just a brief bit about social networks. Social networks are really a managed environment for people to share ideas and comments. Now, you could argue that Twitter is pretty well unmanaged, and any mistake you make is amplified on Twitter in seconds. But it's also an opportunity for people to express their opinions and to seek opinions from others on any particular topic. Same with Facebook. There are idea exchanges. There's a lot of sharing. You can moderate it, but if you try to moderate it too much, someone will get you from another angle. So community is a pretty important part of the 5 C's. Again, it's not new. What's different is how it's broadened and the speed with which you can get a reaction. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about another C, which I believe is the last one, and that is commerce. So once you've educated once your content has educated the consumer, once they've got their information from the community, once you've provided this content and community within a context, that's when it's time to actually exchange money for whatever problem it is that you're trying to solve. And that's where commerce comes in. Next slide, please. And the challenges with today's commerce are clear, and we kind of are all aware of them. Number one is security. Security has been in the news. Now, do I think it's fair to fire a CEO when security is breached? I don't. But do I think security is an issue that we understate and wish would go away? I do. But security is really important. So is scalability. The stories of websites going down at times when great products were being offered are almost legendary, and we have to be really careful to avoid that going forward. Back when I was a CIO, I was, by the way, a CIO and an IT practitioner for about 23 years, and we always did stress testing. Sometimes I wonder if retailers are doing enough stress testing today. Now, within all of this security, which is complicated, scalability, which requires a certain amount of robustness, there's also a need for simplicity in terms of what's facing the user. So it's really pretty critical to put whatever you put in front of the consumer as simple and then extensible, because as we already discussed, more selling channels are going to emerge. And so you want to be able to extend that selling platform into new channels as best as you can. So these are the key challenges in commerce today. And as we move to the next slide, I'll go through them again. It's security, scalability, simplicity, and extensibility. Now, all of this is completely incomplete if you don't have consistency. Consistency means what I see in one channel has to be what I see in another. And without consistency, the customer will walk away. There are retailers who likely would never have put up commerce sites ever. And I don't think, and you'll see why I say this in the data in a couple of minutes, that they would have put up commerce sites, except that their customer had an expectation to see those products elsewhere. And they had to provide a consistent experience across channels. So let's take a look at this last slide here on the subject of the 5 C's, which gives us the 6th C. And consistency may well be the second most important of the, quote, C's that I've presented to you, with customer being the most important, consistency being the second most important, which ultimately will drive you to accomplish commerce, which is what we really want. And I've given you some information and some backdrop. Now what I'd like to do, if we go to the next slide, is talk about some of the research, the relevant research findings that we've had. And this is relatively quick, but they're worth going through. The expectations this is a part of a annual cross-channel strategy study that we do every year around this time of year, maybe a little later. And what we're finding year over year is, if you take a look at this where the blue stars are, it's pretty compelling. Number one, consumer expectations are outpacing our ability to deliver. Our cross-channel experiences, whether they be in the store or on the web, are just not up to snuff with regard to what the consumers want. Then if you look in the next star, it very clearly, more this year, more in 2013 than in 2012, retailers recognized that, geez, they're not leveraging their assets well across different channels. Now, those asset is an interesting concept. I know we think about inventory as an asset, but our digital assets are equally important, and leveraging those across every channel to create the consistent experience we want is extremely, extremely important. Because if you look at the next blue star, a good customer experience in one channel just isn't enough to maintain customer loyalty. Now, that's true. And that goes back to leveraging the assets. It goes back to integrating processes. It goes back to the consumer expectations. You have to find a way, we have to find a way as retailers to have a solid consumer experience, consistent, it's that C word again, across every single channel. And then finally, the way consumers use channel to make purchase decisions is unpredictable. As I said to you before, as we went through before, they've become rather chaotic. And I mean that in the scientific sense, not in the, my room is a mess sense. They've become pretty chaotic, but it's important to do our best to understand it. So these are the expectations and these are the struggles. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. And this talks to this new reality. This was a really interesting finding for us. In 2012, a third of we asked retailers to determine the primary role of digital selling channels. And in 2012, a third of them, which was a plurality, believed that it's all about selling stuff. This year, that number dropped pretty significantly, down to only 14%. And now 25% of retailers recognize that the goal of their digital selling channel is to provide the customer everything she needs to know to buy products and services. Now, if you couple that with the ones who said that they want to educate consumers about our company and brand, which is kind of the same thing, you've got 40% that are saying that the primary role of digital challenge is to give you everything you need to know. Doesn't matter where it is you're going to buy it. And so suddenly, from out of this, consistency becomes as important, and maybe more important, as I said, as all the other C's. Because without it, we're not going to be able to provide customers everything that she needs to know about products and services, or educate the consumer about our company and brand. So what are the key takeaways from out of this? Let's move to the next slide. And the key takeaways, these are just some final thoughts, and then I'm going to pass them on to everyone, to Jason. First of all, it's really important to recognize this isn't a passing fancy. This is strategic, and it's transformative. Enterprises, large enterprises like Gap, have changed their entire organizational structure, recognizing that you need to organize themselves around brand rather than around channel. I understand how we all got to be channel organized. It's because most of our retail enterprises existed before the web came along. So the web came along, it wasn't clear. At first it was a big land grab, and then it sort of settled down some, and ended up growing up as its own organization, pretty typically owned by marketing. So this change isn't going away. It's strategic. It has transformed the retail environment. It will continue to do so. And it's not over. It's an ongoing transformation. And the implication is that retailers have to become more nimble. And along with being more nimble requires a much more holistic approach, to thinking about products and how you buy them and how you store them and how you fulfill orders, a holistic approach in how we organize ourselves, a holistic approach around how we think about our product. And that drives us to the next issue, which is to think about incentives. When you're expecting a store associate to fill an order that was placed online, how do you want to incent them? They didn't generate the demand, but without them the demand couldn't have been fulfilled. So this is pretty important, I think, as an enterprise to think about incentives. It's also important to think about architecture. Now, architecture isn't a sexy subject for many, but without a solid architecture, it's impossible to do all of the other things we talked about. It's impossible to be consistent. It's impossible to be responsive. It's really important. And finally, think about simplicity. We all tend to overcomplicate our worlds, I think, and we have overcomplicated system technology portfolios. But think about simplicity in solution and simplicity in messaging to your retailers. So that covers everything I was going to say. Thank you very much for listening to me. If you want to know more about what we do and how we do it, you can visit our website at www.rsrresearch. All our research is free. And now, Jason. Okay. And if you have questions for me, that's my email address. That's my phone number, and you can register to read our research and our newsletter on that page. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason. Jason, it's you.
Thank you, Paula. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts and insights on retail and commerce, and your colleagues as well, and this was no exception. Very detailed analysis of the 5, now 6 C's. What I wanted to do was kind of shift gears a little bit on the same topic and talk about, as a platform provider, our philosophy and what we think a best practice is around, from a platform perspective, managing this converged content and commerce experience and addressing this omni-channel. It's interesting. We've heard so much about omni-channel, and your point about it being so pervasive. It's almost become the unchannel, that it is everywhere, and customers don't really acknowledge the channel as much as they are just floating in a sea of sort of touch points with their brands now on all these different devices and physical presences. Unification of that is really what we see of the content, and that experience is the key to stop leaving the dollars on the table. From a consumer standpoint, they encounter many different platforms as they navigate through that landscape for a given retailer, and different processes behind those that typically manage content. When you think about from a retailer's perspective, unification is really about making it easier to be nimble and be quick. So if I need to enter a new brand, enter a new market or introduce a new brand, or let's focus on fashion for a second. There's really an imperative in the fashion industry to tell a narrative and tell a story quite often that helps build the brand around your products. And it might be that every week you need to tell a new story to help provide that picture of what your consumers are going to feel like when they're wearing your products. And so that's a very challenging content management exercise to push out that volume of content through all these different channels. So unification, having a unified system to manage that, makes that a much more effective mechanism to do so. Drilling in a little bit into where content lives, I want to get kind of nitty-gritty on some of this a little bit, because there's a lot of nuance and some details can get lost. So you think about where content lives today. Certainly, there are areas on a commerce site. So you've got landing pages. You're driving traffic to landing pages through ads, emails, etc. Search results pages. So much of discovery is search-driven these days that search results pages are a very prominent area where on a site where customers are interacting with your brand and doing product discovery. Product pages themselves, whether it's reviews, product details, descriptions, specs, etc. Commerce pages throughout the purchase flow of a site. And then just general, there's other just kind of content pages as well. And you think about also that content gets pushed off property and is syndicated out to other locations. Perhaps as a retailer, I sell in more than one channel. I need to push product-related content out to other locations to enable purchases on those, perhaps, or into social channels as well. Mobile apps. Mobile is no longer novel for retailers. That's what we've heard repeatedly, is that what what started as a mobile exploration experience, and purchases happening either in-store or on a desktop. The shift in the last, really we saw it predominantly in Q4. There was such a dramatic shift towards complete the purchase on the mobile device. So mobile is no longer novel. It's here, and customers and shoppers expect it. Email is another big source of content where you're pushing out promotions, digital ads and signage. This can be in-store or digital ads that are syndicated out to other locations as well, and as I mentioned before, social. So all these areas where we encounter content. Now, what content elements typically do we see in those locations, and what do we need to effectively manage? Well, digital assets, obviously. So you've got media such as images and videos, PDFs, etc. There's a lot of unstructured content, descriptive textual content that needs to be reused, promotional content as well. Then content that is very closely aligned to product catalog, and this is typically more structured than other content. So you've got product descriptions, once again, a linkage back to some of those digital assets, product imagery, other assets, product specifications. I actually think price is really part of content. Inventory falls in that same bucket as well. Customers more and more have an expectation to know where they can purchase a product, and often it's driven by inventory. So if I need something soon and it's available in the store, I'll get it in the store. If I don't need it soon or it's not available in the store, I'll go buy it online and it'll arrive a few days later. Product reviews, these are either sourced by the community or by experts in a given field, typically not internally generated, obviously, by a retailer, but that content needs to be managed and linked up and sourced. Navigation hierarchies, taxonomy for a site structure, I think also is a critical element of content because it drives that product discovery. And I touched before about search, and this is where I think people overlook sometimes as a fundamental piece of content is there's a lot of metadata that resides around content that drives that discoverability of product data. So SEO tags, SEO metadata to drive web searches, as well as site search and site search tuning rules. So we talk about consistency, and consistency really cannot be achieved without relevancy when you have such a search discovery driven shopping experience. So if I present irrelevant content, it's the same as presenting inconsistent content. It leads to the same confusion that shoppers experience when they see conflicting messages or just inconsistent messages. And then we've touched on as well syndicated content that can be either syndicated inbound from other sources, supplier-fed content, or syndicated outbound by a retailer. Now, typically, we see that managing all of this content involves many different platforms, and it is so cumbersome for most retailers. I think, Paula, you touched on the fact that you don't encounter anybody that says, I have a fantastic IT portfolio and I've got the exact amount of simplicity, et cetera. It's a struggle, and it's driven by a lot of the changes that's happened in the last 7 years, that the old systems, the old platforms, the old ways of managing content and commerce really are not effective in this more connected world. So a lot of retailers just frankly can't provide experiences. They have paltry mobile experiences because they cannot effectively provide and service the content it takes to drive a consistent mobile experience with a consistent in-store experience with a consistent desktop browser experience. Or they do, but it's so costly that it's not effective or really eroding into the margins to try to manage. So the customer is being bombarded with content from all these different systems. They're not necessarily aware that the platforms exist. For the retailers, it's costly. They're struggle to achieve that consistency because they're having to maintain different elements in different systems, and the connectivity is not there between those elements. And that all leads to that consumer confusion, which does nothing but delay purchases or drive consumers to where they're not experiencing this inconsistency in their content, and they go to the competitors. So in terms of closing the gap, We're never going to eliminate the need for there to be multiple content authors and content to have a separate life cycle. So the key from a platform standpoint is to enable content to be sourced from multiple sources, content to be authored by multiple authors internally or externally, content to be sourced from the community, driven into a shared set of repositories. You really keeping your structured catalog content in the same location as digital assets and unstructured content, strictly from a system perspective is not super efficient, but you need those systems and that platform to have a lot of awareness between the repositories that share that, as well as search. And then be able to manage that content from a single interface. What we've found is that, the old WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get interfaces, drive the most effective content management solution. So imagine a world where I can view all my content as a customer or shopper is going to experience it in a page metaphor. I can in that page edit my content. I can also edit my SEO settings, my search, any search tuning rules to boost and bury products, or provide promotional content in page right there on the search results page, and give that very cohesive experience where I can make a change, preview quickly, make a change, preview quickly as a content author, then separate the publishing life cycle from the authoring life cycle. Often we see content authors that may be working in parallel on a particular set of content, then have all of their work batched together, and another team kind of go through a final set of approvals and actually manage the publish out into the world where the shopper is going to experience it. So that's absolutely key. The other key about publishing is when I publish content as a content author, it should be available in every platform or every location where a customer is going to experience it at approximately the same time without a long lag between those systems being aware of that content. That leads to less confusion and that consistency. This model of multiple sources, multiple authors, related or separate repositories but very linked together with a very strong tooling around it leads to that reduced costs, a much more consistent experience. Your customers are engaged. They know what they're going to get. They see the same related consistent content throughout the experience, which leads to not leaving money on the table to the same degree as before. Key, strong tooling for managing and previewing content, that separating the editing workflow from the publish workflow, absolutely critical. Being able to link content to assets, link to products, link to categories, link to search terms, very critical. Promoting reuse within those content repositories. So digital assets, for example, I don't have to upload 4 or 5 different sizes of an image so that my mobile platform can effectively render it separate from my desktop web experience. Having a content management system that is smart enough to take an asset and resize it dynamically based on the platform it's being rendered on. Being able to bring your SEO and search settings into the context of catalog and page content, absolutely critical for driving that relevant delivery of content and then publishing from a single source. All this, I think leads to that goal of providing consistent, seamless experience and simplifying that management process for retailers. And Matt, back to you.
All right, great. A lot of fascinating stuff there. Thanks, Paula and Jason, for that convergence of content in the terms of commerce. Very good dynamic duo there. So we're going to leave you here with some predictions on the future of commerce and content while we gather our Q&A. So we'll leave this up. Feel free to read away, and I'm just going to aggregate a few questions. Thanks for submitting those, and we'll get right to it. All right, thanks so much for your patience. Hopefully you had some good reading while we were getting these together. Again, thanks for submitting your questions. Feel free to submit some of those through into the chat tool. First question for you, Paula, is when I finally have content consistent, it has to change. Story of our lives, right? So how frequent should content change, and what's the timeline I should expect to make those changes?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that you want to keep it as long as it's relevant and as long as it's consistent, I would leave it pretty well the same. I mean, when you're talking about content about a product, unless a model, let's say a model of TV or camera is superseded by a new one, you'd want to leave it there. You certainly don't want to change. You certainly don't want to change descriptions unless something else comes along. What you might want to, you want to make sure that your average reviews continue to change. So I don't think you want to overdo it on changing the content. On the other hand, if something is dated 2013, you know it's pretty stale. So it's really more about how frequently the product is changing that's associated with the content. And timeline-wise, that's a tough question. I would say it depends on what the element is that you're changing. If you're changing a photograph, if you're adding a new kind of image, then you want to give yourself a little time to test it across all your channels, etc. But it should be quick. And again, frequency is, don't change it for the sake of change. Because if a customer's been there 1 week and she wants to take a look again and say, well, what about that TV? Let me refresh my memory, and it's completely changed, that can be disruptive. So it's really more about when there is something material that's different about the product that you're trying to, or solution that you're trying to solve.
That's great insight. Thank you very much. Okay, second question, and this one is for Jason. The question is, if I already have multiple systems and content, how do I consolidate my CMS and migrate things over?
Hey, that's a good question. So typically you need to go through kind of an IA, information architecture exercise, and organize how you want to present your content. As that is kind of the backbone for planning a migration into a platform like Mozu that has a very consolidated content management commerce system. You do that, lay out that backbone of your IA, you identify your sources of all your different elements, and then start migrating over through the open APIs in the platform to build that experience. You'll probably find that there may be some legacy content you can leave behind because it tends to sort of pile up over time. But that IA backbone is pretty critical to having a strong foundation for building on from the future.
Good stuff. Okay, great. Next question coming through, and this one is from Lisa. She asks, Paula, what's the first step to prioritize making the organizational change? I have decision-making organization for marketing and e-commerce, not always on the same page. What's your thoughts on that one?
Well, I think the first question is, where is there the most friction? I mean, marketing and e-commerce are more often together than they are separate. The real question is, how do you merge e-commerce in with IT, and can you? And then the second question after that is, are you fulfilling from stores? Are you breaking through your channel barriers in general? So the first step is to figure out to understand how you want to run your business. Then you need to start making organizational changes so that people can work in sync. Now, you don't have to necessarily change reporting structures. You can just get cross-functional teams together. We found, particularly in merchandising, bringing cross-functional teams together is more valuable than just changing organizational structures. That means that a senior executive really has to be in charge of driving that decision-making process. I think the single biggest thing that has to happen in any retail enterprise is to merge channels under a brand. I just think that's the most critical option. So that means that digital marketing and traditional marketing need to be under one umbrella. That means that online merchandising and in-store and merchants for stores have to be in one group, and that you have one open to buy across all organizations, and you have one purchasing process across all organizations. The other question that gets interesting, and I think I touched on it before, is compensation strategies for stores and other channels. And it may be fairly complex because it may require keeping basically multiple sets of books, because in a sense you want to compensate the channel that generated the demand, and you also want to compensate the channel that fulfilled the demand. So you need to, the first thing to think about is getting people to talk to each other. The next thing to think about is how do we get them to work together. And then the third thing to think about is how do we reward them for those behaviors. Because if we are rewarding a store on store turn and not on what they do for the web, it's unlikely that they're going to be as responsive. I have just a very basic general rule of thumb, and that is that people do what they're paid to do, no more, no less. So at the end of the day, you have to make sure you compensate them based on that. So hopefully that answers the question. Did that feel clear to you guys? Is there anything more I need to say?
No, I think that was great. Very detailed. Thank you.
Cool.
All right, so let's continue the ping-pong Q&A. Jason, ball's in your court now. Quick question for you. So in your opinion, this is from Brent. Thanks, Brent. Which retail product categories, be it apparel, consumer electronics, grocery, along those lines, which of those categories do you see as best in class, and which are laggards at delivering consistency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you can look at some of those verticals and see the need and shopper behavior has kind of forced a stronger need for consistency on certain types of content. And I'm going to take consumer electronics for one. It really, the product specification, catalog, visual, that sort of nature of the consumer electronics, where I can look at it and find out the attributes of the product. I'm looking at how many ports of a certain type does it have, what's the screen size, memory, et cetera, really lended itself early on to pushing content and making it available, that product specification content available. So I think in terms of product-related content, I'd say consumer electronics has been pushed there the farthest, the fastest. When I think of showrooming and web rooming, that's the industry that I kind of go to in my mind first. That's not to say that there aren't other players in other verticals that have pushed that very far as well. When I think about more unstructured content, promotional content, I touched on it a little earlier around fashion and kind of the need for a story, and that branding and is so critical in that industry. So I think you think about for apparel, and if I visit a retailer site and they've got a particular brand and a story around the season's products, a given set of products, I'll see that on the site, and I'll see the same thing in the store. So I think for that unstructured sort of storytelling content, apparel is probably the one that's leading in that regard in terms of trying to provide that consistent experience, and that's once again driven by consumer demand. Laggards, I can't think of a particular vertical that's a laggard more than another, but it certainly is. The ability and the effectiveness that retailers had in managing this consistency it's varied based on where they are in their journey in acknowledging omni-channel and the customer interactions and how they can break down some of their old paradigms and get there.
Can I jump in a little too, Jason?
Yeah,
absolutely, Paul.
Even though I don't have the ball, I'll jump in anyhow. I think that laggards actually ended up, and they're moving along now, it ended up being the off-price industry. So you think about H&M or TJX, and they would have much rather not have been consistent across channels because their message is it's a treasure hunt. And warehouse stores are still kind of trying to maintain that, for want of a better term, Chinese wall between the channels, where just because I'm selling it to you online doesn't mean it's going to be in the stores, and nothing is the same. I think that those days are kind of coming to an end. So I would say first, the second to last laggard, if you will, was discount stores, and the last of the laggards are warehouse stores. And the argument is, well, it's a treasure hunt. And that metaphor, it kind of works, but it doesn't really work as a treasure hunt where the treasure hunt in the store is different than the treasure hunt online. That's an exercise in frustration. So I would say they are probably the most lagging at the moment. Grocery has yet to get very serious across channels, and for them it's more about the price. I think they depend more on the CP manufacturers to provide a lot of the product descriptions than themselves. But definitely I would place warehouse stores at the bottom of the list.
Very interesting. All right, Paula, we're going to keep the ball in your court, and we're actually going to take this international. So Brent has another question, and he's curious to know, which markets outside of the United States do you see as leaders in delivering consistency?
That's an interesting question. The UK is moving along. We've ended up, for a variety of reasons, getting a lot of survey respondents out of the UK. They're a bit behind, but they are catching up quickly. And then China, we can't really ignore them. I mean, Alibaba and some of the various sites that they have over there are stunning. Now, do they have consistency with the store? I haven't been there, but they certainly have been powerful in terms of creating online presences. But I would say cross-channel-wise, you think about the UK and they have click and collect. They're pretty advanced. They're moving along. But honestly, the US has been in the lead in this area. Really has.
Great stuff. Okay, so final question, and Jason, this is for you, and it's platform specific. Michael's asking us, so are there any limitations on the number of content elements with the Mozu platform?
Okay, that's a good question. No, that's part of the benefit of being kind of in a SaaS environment where we can scale with a lot of elasticity. So not really, any limitations we've encountered. We've built it for large scale, multi-site, being able to author different flavors and versions of content related to key entities. So not really a limitation. We haven't encountered anybody that has a use case that's stressed the system beyond its limits thus far.
Great stuff. All right, well, with that, we will wrap things up. Thank you so much to everyone that came out and joined us this afternoon. A really interesting conversation. Paula, thank you, as always, for your expertise. And Jason, thank you for your insights as well. We'll be sending out the presentation via the email address that you used to register. We'll also have information on our social channels. So if you have any questions or if you'd like to learn more about the Mozu platform and how we can really help deliver upon content and commerce, make sure to just visit our website at mozu.com. We're happy to run you through a demonstration, and we will go from there. All right, everyone, thanks again. Hope you'll have a wonderful day. See you soon.